The time has come. We are on chapter 15. Honestly, this isn't a joke, okay? We have come to the conclusion of Hillbilly Elegy. Oh, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for spending this time with me. You could be doing absolutely anything with your time, and I know how valuable it is. So I just want to get ahead of this and thank you for any amount of time you're spending with me, whether it is 1 minute, 5 minutes, or the hours I have spent reading this book to you guys. So thank you so much. So to get it started, JD is setting the scene for us at a motel where he is booking a room for his mom. And let's jump right in. I gave the woman my credit card, and she was clearly unprepared. Normally, people pay cash, she explained. I told her, yeah, but like I said on the phone, I'm going to pay with a credit card. I can run to an ATM if you'd prefer. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I forgot. But it's okay. We've got one of those machines around here somewhere. So she retrieved one of those ancient card swiping machines, the kind that imprint the card's information on a yellow slip of paper. When I handed her the card, her eyes seemed to plead with me as if she were a prisoner in her own life. Enjoy your stay, she said, which struck me as an odd instruction. I had told her on the phone not an hour earlier that the room wasn't for me, it was for my homeless mother. Okay, I said, thanks. I was a recent graduate of Yale Law School, a former editor of the prestigious Yale Law Journal, and a member of the bar in good standing. Just 2 months earlier, Usha and I were married on a beautiful day in eastern Kentucky. My entire family showed up for the occasion, and we both changed our name to Vance, giving me, finally, the same name as my family which I belonged. That part. Because not only did he switch his name to his grandmother's family name, Vance, but so did his new wife. And that just hits so hard in the heart. You know, he wants to represent the family that actually raised him, that he loves. And I believe him having that name is such an honor, especially given how far our boy JD has come. Okay, so I'd sworn to myself that I'd never help mom again. But the person who made that oath to himself had changed. I was exploring, however uneasily, the Christian faith that I had discarded years earlier. I had learned for the first time the extent of mom's childhood emotional wounds, and I had realized that those wounds never truly heal, even for me. So what I discovered that mom was in dire straits. I didn't mutter insults under my breath and hang up the phone. I offered to help her. And then here he just goes into how he called this motel beforehand, tried to give the credit card information over the phone, which they wholly rejected. He also goes through kind of the struggle and back and forth that he has had in his past with supporting his mother. And he put this plan together pretty much, I'll pay this much for a hotel, then help my mom get her nursing degree back, and blah, 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 blah. And he's like, oh my goodness, if this isn't a repeat of what Mama and Papa did with Beverly or his mom his entire life. So it kind of just threw him back into what he knew his grandparents were trying to do for his mother. However unsuccessfully they were, he was in the same position that he had previously criticized them for having that hope. People sometimes ask whether I think there is anything we can do to solve the problems of my community. I know that they're looking for a magical public policy solution or an innovative government program, but these problems of family, faith, and culture aren't like a Rubik's Cube. And I don't think that solutions, as most understand the term, really exist. A good friend who worked for a time in the White House and cares deeply about the plight of the working class once told me the best way to look at this might be to recognize that you probably can't fix these things. They'll always be around, but maybe you can put your thumb on the scale a little for the people at the margins. There were many thumbs put on my scale when I look back at my life. What jumps out is how many variables had to fall into place in order to give me a chance. There was my grandparents' constant presence. Even when my mother and stepfather moved far away in effort to shut them out, despite the revolving door of would-be father figures, I was often surrounded by caring, kind men. Even with her failures, Mom instilled in me a lifelong love of education and learning. My sister always protected me, even after I'd physically outgrown her. Dan and Aunt Wee opened their home when I was too afraid to ask. Long before that, they were my first real exemplars of a happy and loving marriage. There were teachers, distant relatives, and friends. Remove any of these people from the equation, and I'm probably screwed. Other people who have overcome the odds cite the same sorts of interventions. Jane Rex runs the transfer students office at an Appalachian State University. Like me, she grew up in a working class family and was its first member to attend college. She's also been married for nearly 40 years and raised 3 successful kids of her own. Ask what made a difference in her life, and she'll tell you about the stable family that empowered her and gave her a sense of control over her future. And she'll tell you about the power of seeing enough of the world to dream big. I think you have to have good role models around you. One of my very good friends, her father was the president of the bank. So I got to see different things. I knew there was another life out there, and that exposure gives you something to dream for. My cousin Gail is one of my all time favorite people. She's one of the first of my mom's generation, the Blanton grandchildren. Gail's life is the American dream personified: a beautiful house, 3 great kids, a happy marriage, and a saintly demeanor. Outside of Mamaw Blanton, a virtual deity in the eyes of us grandkids and great grandkids, I've never heard anyone else called the nicest person in the world. For Gail, it's an entirely deserved title. I assume that Gail had inherited her storybook life from her parents. No, no one's that nice, I thought, especially not someone who has suffered any real adversity. But Gail Blanton, at heart, a hillbilly, and I should have known that no hillbilly makes it to adulthood without a few major screw ups along the way. Gail's home life provided its own emotional baggage. She was 7 when her dad walked out, and 17 when she graduated from high school, planning for college at Miami University. But there was a catch, Mom told me. I couldn't go to college unless I broke up with my boyfriend. So I moved out a day after graduation, and by August, I was pregnant. Almost immediately, her life began to disintegrate. Racial prejudice bubbled at the surface when she announced that a black baby was joining the family. Announcements led to arguments, and then one day, Gail found herself without a family. I didn't hear from our relatives, Gail told me. My mom said she never wanted to hear my name again. Given her age and lack of family support, it's hardly surprising that her marriage soon ended. But Gail's life had grown considerably more complex. She hadn't just lost her family, she'd gained a young daughter who depended entirely on her. It completely changed my life. Being a mom was my identity. I might have been a hippie, but now I had rules: no drugs, no alcohol, nothing that was going to lead to social services taking my baby away. So here's Gail, a single teenage mom, no family, little support. A lot of people would wilt in those circumstances, but the hillbilly took over. Dad wasn't really around, Gail remembered, and hadn't been in years. I obviously wasn't speaking to Mom, but I remember the one lesson I took from them, and that was that we could do anything we wanted. I wanted that baby, and I wanted to make it work, so I did. She got a job with a local telephone company and worked her way up the ladder, even returned to college. By the time she remarried, she had hit one hell of a stride. The storybook marriage to her second husband, Alan, is just the icing on the cake. Some version of Gail's story often rears its head. When I grew up, you watch as teenagers find themselves in dire straits, sometimes of their own making and sometimes not. The statistics are stacked high against them, and many succumb to crime or to an early death, at worst, domestic strife and welfare dependency at best. But others make it. There's Rex Jane, there's Lindsay, who blossomed in the midst of Mama's death, Aunt Wee, who put her life on track after ditching an abusive husband. Each benefited from the same types of experiences in one way or another. They had a family member they could count on, and they saw from a family friend, an uncle, or a work mentor what was available and possible. Not long after I began thinking about what might help the American working class get ahead, a team of economists, including Raj Chetty, published a groundbreaking study on opportunity in America. Unsurprisingly, they found that poor kids' chances of rising through the ranks of America's meritocracy were lower than most of us wanted. By their metrics, a lot of European countries seemed better than America at the American dream. More important, they discovered that opportunity was not spread evenly over the whole country. In places like Utah, Oklahoma, and Massachusetts, the American dream was doing just fine, as good or better than other places in the world. It was in the South, the Rust Belt, and Appalachia where poor kids really struggled. Their findings surprised a lot of people, but not me, and not anyone who'd spent any time in these areas. In a paper analyzing the data, Chetty and his co-authors noted two important factors that explained the uneven geographic distribution of opportunity: the prevalence of single parents and income segregation. Growing up around a lot of single moms and dads and living in a place where most of your neighbors are poor really narrows the realm of possibilities. It means that unless you have a mama and papa to make sure you stay the course, you might never make it out. It means that you don't have people to show you by example what happens when you work hard and get an education. It means essentially that everything that made it possible for me, Lindsay, Gail, Jane, Rex, and Aunt Wee to find some measure of happiness is missing. So I wasn't surprised that Mormon Utah, with its strong church integrated communities and intact families, wiped the floor with Rust Belt Ohio. There are, I think, policy lessons to draw from my life, ways we might put our thumb on the all important scale. We can adjust how our social service system treat families like mine. Remember that when I was 12, I watched Mom get hauled away in a police cruiser. I'd seen her get arrested before, but I knew this time was different. We were in the system now, with social worker visits and mandated family counseling, and a court date hanging over my head like a guillotine blade. Ostensibly, the caseworkers were there to protect me, but it became very obvious very early in the process that they were obstacles to overcome. When I explained that I spent most of my time with my grandparents and I'd like to continue with that arrangement, they replied that courts would not necessarily sanction such an arrangement. In the eyes of the law, my grandmother was an untrained caretaker without a foster license. If things went poorly for my mother in courts, I was likely to find myself with a foster family, as I was with Mamaw. The notion of being separated from everyone and everything I loved was terrifying. So I shut my mouth, told the social workers everything was fine, and hoped that I wouldn't lose my family when the court hearing came. That hope panned out. Mom didn't go to jail, and I got to stay with Mamaw. The arrangement was informal. I could stay with Mom if I wanted, but if not, Mamaw's door was always open. The enforcement mechanism was equally informal. Mamaw would kill anyone who tried to keep me from her. This worked for us because Mamaw was a lunatic, and our entire family feared her. Not everyone can rely on the saving grace of a crazy hillbilly. Child services are for many kids the last pieces of the safety net. If they fall through, precious little remains to catch them. Part of the problem is how state laws define family. For families like mine, and for many Black and Hispanic families, grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles play an outsized role. Child services often cut them out of the picture, as they did in my case. Some states require occupational licensing for foster parents, just like nurses and doctors, even when the would-be foster parent is a grandmother or another close family member. In other words, our country's social services weren't made for hillbilly families, and they often make a bad problem worse. I wish I could say this was a small problem, but it's not. In a given year, 640,000 children, most of them poor, will spend at least some time in foster care. Add that to the unknown number of kids who face abuse or neglect but somehow avoid the foster care system, and you have an epidemic, one that current policies exacerbate. There are other things we can do. We can build policy based on better understanding of what stands in the way of kids like me. The most important lesson of my life is not that society failed to provide me with opportunities. My elementary and middle schools were entirely adequate, staffed with teachers who did everything they could to reach me. Our high school ranked near the bottom of Ohio schools, but that had little to do with the staff and much to do with the students. I had Pell Grants and government subsidized, low interest student loans that made college affordable, and need based scholarships for law school. I never went hungry, thanks at least in part to the old age benefits Mama generously shared with me. These programs are far from perfect, but to the degree that I nearly succumbed to my worst decision and came quite close, the fault lies almost entirely with factors outside of government control. Recently, I sat down with a group of teachers from my alma mater, Middleton High. All of them expressed the worry in one form or another, that society devoted too many resources too late in the game. It's like our politicians think college is the only way, one teacher told me. For many, it's great, but for a lot, our kids have no realistic shot of getting a college degree. Another said, the violence and the fighting, it's all they've seen from a very young age. One of my students lost her baby like she lost her car keys, had no idea where it went, and 2 weeks later, her child turned up in New York City with the father, a drug dealer, and some of his family. Short of a miracle, we all know what kind of life awaits that poor baby. Yet, there's precious little to support her now when the interventions might help. So I think that any successful policy program would recognize what my old high school teachers see every day, that the real problem for so many of these kids is what happens or doesn't happen at home. For example, we'd recognize that Section 8 vouchers ought to be administered in a way that doesn't segregate poor into the enclaves. As Brian Campbell, another Middleton teacher, told me, when you have a large base of Section 8 parents and kids supported by fewer middle class taxpayers, it's an upside down triangle. There are fewer emotional and financial resources when the only people in a neighborhood are low income. You just can't lump them together because you have a bigger pool of hopelessness. On the other hand, he said, put the lower income kids with those who have a different lifestyle model, and lower income kids start to rise up. Yet, when Middleton recently tried to limit the number of Section 8 vouchers offered within certain neighborhoods, the federal government balked. Better, I suppose, to keep those kids cut off from the middle class. Government policy may be powerless to resolve other problems in our community. As a child, I associated accomplishments in school with femininity. Manless, manlessness meant strength. No, sorry. Manliness meant strength, courage, a willingness to fight, and latter, success with girls. Boys who got good grades were sissies or FAGGOTS. I don't know where I got this feeling. Certainly not from Mama, who demanded good grades, nor from Papa, but it was there. And studies now show that working class boys like me do much worse in school because they view schoolwork as a feminine endeavor. Can you change this with a new law or program? Probably not. Some scales aren't amenable to the proverbial thumb. I've learned that the very traits that enabled my survival during childhood inhibit my success as an adult. I see conflict and I run away or prepare for battle. This makes little sense in my current relationships, but without that attitude, my childhood homes would have consumed me. I learned early to spend my money out lest mom or someone else find it and borrow it. When later in life, Usha and I consolidated finances, she was shocked to learn that I had multiple bank accounts and small past due balances on credit cards. Usha still sometimes reminds me that not every perceived slight from a passing motorist or neighbor a neighbor is cause for a blood feud. And I always concede, despite my raw emotions, that she's probably right. A couple of years ago, I was driving in Cincinnati with Usha when somebody cut me off. I honked, the guy flipped me off, and when we stopped at a red light with this guy in front of me, I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the car door. I planned to demand an apology and fight the guy if necessary. But my common sense prevailed. I shut the door before I got out of the car. Usha was delighted. And Usha was delighted that I'd changed my mind before she yelled at me to stop acting like a lunatic, which has happened in the past. And she told me that she was proud of me for resisting my natural instinct. The other driver's sin was to insult my honor. And it was on that honor that that nearly every element of my happiness depended on as a child. It kept the school bully from messing with me, connected me to my mother when some man or his children insulted her, even if I agreed with the substance of the insult, and gave me something, however small, over which I exercised complete control. For the first 18 or so years of my life, standing down would have earned me a verbal lashing as a pussy or a wimp or a girl. The objectively correct course of action was something that the majority of my life had taught me was repulsive to an upstanding young man. For a few hours after I did the right thing, I silently criticized myself. But that's progress, right? Better than sitting in jail, better than sitting in a jail cell for teaching that asshole a lesson about defensive driving. Okay, and then we are at the conclusion. And I want to point out one thing first that he mentions. I'll get to the conclusion in our last video, which will be out on Thursday. But today I just want to discuss a little bit about what he mentioned in the lessons that he learned as a child. I think we can all take away from that. There are things that we've all learned in our childhood to survive that helped us on a day-to-day basis get through to where we are now, but now in adult life do not serve us. Whether it is with the way that we handle conflict. With me personally, my dad would yell and scream at us a lot. And so anytime there's conflict, I freeze and I don't talk. I don't engage in conflict because what I learned as a child is I just really need to be quiet, let this pass for my own safety. And today, when my husband gets upset and expresses frustration or his voice gets a little above a normal octave, I'm immediately like, okay, I'm just going to shut up and let this pass when I don't need to be. After 17 years, my husband has done nothing to like validate the fear that I have. It's an unrealistic fear. So that's something I'm personally working on that I learned as a child that doesn't help me one bit as an adult. So if you recognize any of those things, take note of it and understand that it's nothing personally that you're doing wrong. It's just that the lessons you learned as a child, you don't need those anymore. You're safe now. So I just wanted to address a little bit of that before we get into our real last portion of this book and start to look at what we are going to do next. So again, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you have a great afternoon, and I will see you again on Thursday.